All right, we have yet another rich discussion in store for you here today. We've done that pretty well all this week. So first, say good morning to John. Hey, John.
Hey, good morning, Peter.
That's John King over there. I'm Peter Christian. Joining us in the studio this morning, Dr. Peter Koehn with the University of Montana Political Science Department. Peter, good morning, sir.
Good morning to you, Peter, and to everyone out there.
So it's going to be a little bit confusing. We have Peter and Peter of Beverly Hills. So, so tell us a little about Dr. Koehn. What's up with you? How did you end up at the University of Montana Political Science Department?
Well, that's a very interesting question. As a matter of fact, I was teaching in Ethiopia at the time, and I saw the advertisement for a position open at the University of Montana. And I had finished my PhD, or about to finish my PhD at the University of Colorado, so I was loving the West. But I had a very fond memory of Montana. I had been here once before with my parents when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And we took a tour of Glacier National Park. And I remember going over the Sun Road. I remember falling in love with Montana. So when this job opened up, I said, wow, this is a place I would really love to be. And the joke is, or what my colleagues told me, is that they interviewed a number of people for the job, and they didn't like anyone. But they couldn't interview me because I was in Ethiopia, and so that's why they gave me the job.
They didn't give you the chance to not like you.
That's right. It was too far to bring.
How long ago is this? How long have you been with
I've been here about 44 years, John.
Wow, you and Peter are a team.
Yeah, I started my radio career in 1973.
I was 72.
Yeah, well, there you go. See? Well, let's go have coffee. The heck with the show. All right, so tell us what it is about the Political Science Department at the University of Montana that has kept you riveted right here in Missoula for so long.
Well, I think partly the students. I love the students here, and we've had students who've gone on to do some amazing things, students of all political persuasions. I particularly am interested in overseas kinds of things. Most of my teaching has to do with, as you can imagine, coming here from Ethiopia, has to do with other parts of the world, especially Africa. And then later on, I was the director of international programs here, so I had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in Asia. I love international travel. I love international folks. And I love Montana, so those were the things that kept me here.
Interesting. Now, I understand for today, you're kind of using your international prowess to clue us in as to what's going on November 30th. We hear there's supposed to be talks of climate change talks, I guess they're calling it the COP21 meetings going on in France. Tell us a little bit about this, what it's all about, and what's led up to this moment, if you could.
Yeah, thanks, John. And that's why I was happy to come here today, because I'm in the process of finishing a book on the topic of China and climate change. And this book will be out in December, right after the conference. You know, one of the ironies is that people have been talking about this conference as Paris 2015. And now I'm afraid that label is going to get confused with some other events that happened in Paris in 2015. So, you know, I've been interested in China for some time. I lived in China for 2 years. I taught there, and I experienced heavy pollution when I lived in Shanghai in China. So that was a concern of mine. That was around the mid-1990s, and so things have gotten even worse. You know, we've often said that if we're going to make any progress in terms of climate change, China has to be part of the equation. And under the Kyoto Protocol, they were essentially left out. Things have changed. China today produces about 28% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions, and they're on task to reach 30% by 2030. So China has to be part of the equation. So that's why I've been doing research on China and what it's trying to do in terms of arresting some of these emissions.
Let me ask you this. I think a lot of people have the feeling that this is going to be more talking and nothing's going to happen. Even if it's a positive outcome, it'll probably look like the Kyoto Protocols, which ended in almost nothing. What about the skepticism out there? How would you address that?
Well, I think, you know, even as the lead up to Paris, There have been commitments. What they're doing now is they're asking countries to make individual commitments. They're not trying to have the same blanket, generalized requirements for everyone, but they want countries to make their own individual commitments. And so most of these are already on the table. So we kind of know already what's going to come out of this. And in the case of China, for example, they've said that by the year 2030, they're going to make some really serious changes in the amount of carbon dioxide they pump into the atmosphere. They're going to put a cap on coal. There are all kinds of things that they've already committed to. So I don't think it's going to be the same as Kyoto. It's going to be different in the sense that there'll be a wide variety of different commitments, some of which will be helpful, some of which might not be very helpful. And taking them all together, it's probably not enough, but it's a step in the right direction.
Let me push that a little bit further. I think there's something like 160 plus countries involved in the talks. They were supposed to have submitted those plans that you mentioned by October 1st, if I'm not mistaken, and 50 countries didn't even send any in. That's a sign that people aren't taking it seriously, it seems to me. But second of all, even those countries that did send them in, like the United States, that process didn't go through our legislature and has to be ratified later, it seems to me, and will unlikely be able to pass that muster if they're stringent. The third thing is that even if these countries say they're going to do these things to control climate, there's usually very little in the form of sticks or carrots to make sure that the countries abide by their promises.
There's no, and is there some sort of enforcement mechanism?
That's what it's getting at.
To say, well, you didn't do this, therefore we're not going to do trade with you, or are the others who signed the protocol are saying, well, because you didn't live up to your end of the bargain, we're going to punish you in some way. Is that something that may be possible?
Well, no, I think that's a legitimate point. I think that there isn't really very much of an enforcement mechanism, and there hasn't been in terms of Kyoto either. I think that, and this is one of the arguments I make in my book, I think that the issue of what we're going to do about emissions and whether we're going to adopt more renewable energies, I think a lot of that has to come from voluntary action. It's not. I'm not a really huge believer in international treaties, and in fact, the research that I did in China was at what I call the subnational level. What I'm interested in is what's happening at the grassroots, what's happening among businesses, what's happening among governments, what's happening among individuals, and I think that's where the real potential lies for making some significant changes. Where they're not, these are going to be voluntary changes, and they're going to be voluntary because people are going to understand that it's in their interest, and countries are going to understand that it's in their interest to do something about this problem.
I guess my question for you is, if that's the key to the problem or solving the problem, what good are the COP21 talks? I mean, how are they going to influence or affect that in any positive way?
Well, I think you have to work at both levels. I think you have to work at all levels, and I think you have to work at the international level because whether you have teeth or not to enforce things, as you pointed out earlier, still, this is a case where you don't want free riders. You don't want people or countries getting in without doing anything while other countries make huge commitments and sacrifices. So I think it's important to have those discussions and to have that kind of a consensus built at the international level, but where the real action is, it seems to me, is going to be at the local level, at the subnational level. So you need the commitments of your national governments too, but sometimes the lead is taken by governments at lesser levels. We look at what California is doing here in this country; it's way ahead of every place else. So I think you need to work at all of those levels.
And so, give me an idea of some of these subnational groups. It's understandable when we come into the United States and we see the different states behaving differently. But what are you talking about as a subnational group, for example, in China or in Germany or another one of these countries? Yeah,
great. So, in China, for example, we've got all kinds of things going on today, which are pretty impressive, actually. And they're not enough, but there's pretty impressive stuff going on. For example, there's one city that has a program called Green Bounty Hunters, where citizens go out and try to identify industries that are polluting that haven't been designated.
It should be fairly easy.
That's right.
Like this circle right here.
And they get a reward if they do that, and so that's made some changes. And there are lots of things going on in terms of rooftop solar systems, in terms of lighting, but LED lighting. There's all kinds of things going on at the local government level. Now, the other thing that's really interesting in China, one of my interests is in health. And when I was in Shanghai, I told you it was really polluted, and I could feel the difference every day I got up and walked outside in terms of my lungs. And the estimates are that about 1.2 million people in China die prematurely every year because of particulates and air pollution. So I'm thinking that if people in China, and they're very concerned about health, decide that they need to protect their own health, that's also going to result in reductions in greenhouse gases, because a lot of the same processes that cause air pollution are responsible for greenhouse gases. So we have one of the things that happened in China in March of this year was a journalist, actually, a former journalist, did an independent documentary called, I forgot the name of it right now, Under the Dome. And she documented the health effects of air pollution throughout China. And as a result of this, there was something like 100 million different hits on this particular documentary. And it really shook up the government, because all of a sudden people were saying, wait, we see what the consequences of this air pollution are, and they were worried that there might be some ramifications of that.
Let me ask you this, Doctor. Does tourism play a part in this? Because I know China loves American tourists, American dollars, like any other country does. But when somebody flies over a Shanghai, or Beijing or whatever, and sees this massive pollution, that's the last place they want to go. So is that part of the driving force that's saying we need to clean this up?
I think that's probably part of it. I'm not sure it's a very big part of it. And I think today most of the tourism in China is going the other way. Right. That Chinese tourists are coming here, they're going to Japan, they're going to other places.
Which reminds me of the news story we had just the other day about, I know this is just a little bit of an aside, but Grand Teton National Park has all these pit toilets, and the toilet seats were all broken because many of the Asian visitors were squatting on top of them rather than sitting on them and breaking them off. So they have to put little signs up saying, here's how to use this toilet in America. So,
this problem works both ways. When I was in Japan, they had instructions for the foreigners on how to use the floor toilets in Japan. So, yeah, there's nuances.
Oh,
to
yes, there certainly are.
All of the ins and outs that nature affords.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. The tourism is coming this way. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that's also happening, and this is something I think of concern to political leaders in China, is that people are buying out. The wealthy people in China are leaving China because they don't want to live in a situation of that's characterized by such deep air pollution, and they don't want to expose their families to that kind of thing.
Is it just air pollution, or does it also involve water pollution and other types of environmental impacts?
Oh, yeah, there's very serious water pollution as well in China, and that usually comes from other sources than things that are connected to climate change, for example. That often comes from industrial wastes that are just dumped into rivers. And so you can see the rivers running black sometimes. In fact, there's a book by a China expert called with that title. But they've done a lot to try to improve in that area as well.
Once a month, we like to have a member of the Political Science Department at the University of Montana drop by and talk about a topic that's important to them. Dr. Peter Koehn is visiting with us today about climate change and, of course, the big conference coming up in Paris later on. But right now, let's get to our callers. James, good morning. You're on with Dr. Koehn. Hi.
Hi, Dr. Koehn. Can you hear me okay? My phone is a little bit funny.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've got you, James.
Okay, good. Hey, I just had a question for you. I'm wondering... Okay, so just to kind of give a basis for my question, I'm kind of middle of the road as far as the climate change from a political standpoint, and I get real turned off when it gets politicized because I think it shouldn't be at all. Unfortunately, it is. But in the early 90s, when you were in China and things were really bad there, I made my first trip to L.A., and it was awful, and I was shocked by it, and it was just horrible. And I've been back since and noted improvements. And for me personally, there's a bigger pull for addressing climate issues without addressing it as climate change, and the political stereotypes that we get with it. And I'm wondering how that plays over in China and maybe in India. How much do you appeal to people's own concern for their local health? Regardless of what kind of an impact we have on the environment globally, for me, it hit home a lot more when it was addressed as, look at the quality of the air that we're breathing where we live and how this is affecting us.
Right.
And then, so there's that side of it, and there's also the motivational side, whether you believe climate change is man-made or whatever. But I'm a businessman, and from a business standpoint, when I research the opportunities in alternative fuels, biofuels, there are so many substantial opportunities out there that are just, they're interesting, they're effective, they're efficient, they're affordable.
Hey, James,
And I just want to know what kind of push they put on those.
We
two
gotta
areas.
let you go so we can give them a chance to respond before we run out of time. in
thanks
this
for your
break,
call.
okay?
Dr. Koehn, go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you and you should have been co-authoring my book with me, James, because that's exactly the argument I make with regard to China. I think that most people in China are aware of climate change, but they're not ready to make any actions based on climate change itself. And I think that's pretty common around the world. So I think that what makes people act is when they see it has an impact on their own health. And that's why the fact that emissions of greenhouse gases are also pollutants makes a huge difference. And I think that is going to be the compelling factor in China. So I agree with you that I call it framing. If you frame the issue as a health issue, which it is, you're likely to get a lot more public response than if you just pitch it as climate change, which is something you can't taste or feel, and it's generations down the road.
Been waiting very patiently on the phone. Mike, you're on with Dr. Koehn. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, Doctor. I got a couple questions for you. How old are you?
I'm 71.
Oh, 70. What was your background? What would you do when you was a kid? Where was you raised at? I'll put it that way.
I grew up in New York. And,
New York City?
Just the usual. No, outside of New York City. The usual.
Yeah. Okay, did you
studied.
ever work outside for a living?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, well, now I'll tell you why you get away with this climate change nonsense. Well,
All right.
no, I'm serious.
Go ahead.
You can laugh if you want, but tell me who works outside this day and age. I've been a logger for years, and I don't. The only thing I see is a guy in a harvester with a thermostatically controlled cab, for crying out loud. That's not the same as walking out there with a chainsaw. But the reason we get away with this nonsense of climate change is nobody works outside. We have just got better at putting up with cold weather. And the other side of it is, I've been a trapper since about 70-some years, and I've spent that time walking around trapping open water over the years. And you know what? It freezes me out dang near every year pretty much the same time. By the 15th of November, we're usually through trapping open water because it gets cold and freezes. So every time I hear this, and if you're 70-some years old and go back to think, what would happen if we switched out all these vehicles we got sitting around Missoula to 6-volt car batteries as we had in the 50s or 40s? Tell me what would happen. Not a damn thing would run in this town. So what's your answer to that one? Because it doesn't. Nobody works outside the war.
Well, actually,
All right, let's give him a chance.
Actually,
Thanks, Mike.
one of the groups of people that do work outside here in Montana are outfitters. And the whole tourist industry is really taking seriously what's going on in terms of climate change. I mean, have you noticed we don't have quite as many glaciers as we used to?
But we have nearly twice the number of tourists.
And we have a lot more tourists. Right?
So I don't know if that's such a problem, maybe.
Well, I think people are worried about the future, and there's fires is another issue. In fact, that's part of the answer that I wanted to give to John's question earlier.
Oh, yeah, let me remind them of the question real quick.
Okay.
So we were talking before the top of the hour about how that it needs to be a grassroots solution, that people need to feel like they're changing their own breathable air, their own clean water to drink, and have a direct impact in order to actually solve the problem. So with that said, I asked
Has to have
Dr.
some
Koehn.
self-interest.
Yeah, I asked Dr. Koehn, well, how do you sell that message to a place like Montana where the air is pretty clear and the water's pretty good to drink?
I think there are two answers to that I can think of off the top of my head. One is acid rain, and the other is fires. So one of the things that we see happening more and more today because of global climate change. And remember that when climates change, they don't change in all places in the same way. So there's microclimates that come into effect. But one of the things that we're experiencing here in Montana is smoke from fires in the area, even as far away as California. That's definitely a health issue that I think can appeal to people. I mean, I feel it. I don't know about you, John, but when I'm at home in the middle of the summer and it's 90 degrees and I can't open my windows because of the smoke outside, that bothers me.
Sure, I do. I don't pin the problem on climate change, but yeah, I have a problem with it.
Okay, let's get back to the phone. John, you've been waiting very patiently, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, first I want to make a comment that I lived in the L.A. region in the early 70s, and it was really bad. But that's not my question. My question is there a correlation between climate change and the sage-grouse? I know that they want to put the sage-grouse on the endangered species list, and how would that affect climate change?
Wow, just ask the western states. They've been dancing around this topic for the last 2 years.
Well,
Go ahead, Doctor.
John, you got me on that one. I really don't know.
I know the answer. So one of the reasons why the states want to take over the sage-grouse issue instead of having the EPA do it is because the area where the sage-grouse live is also largely the area where fracking is occurring.
And grazing.
Apparently,
and grazing.
Yeah. Sage-grouse apparently cannot do the horizontal mumbo unless if there's anything taller than a stick casting a shadow in the region. And so basically the fear is that the EPA, fear by many of these states, including your own governor, who's a Democrat, is that the EPA would make it hard for these areas to be profitable economically. How that impacts climate change is indirect, obviously, but if you don't have people pumping oil out of the ground, right, there's less oil out on the market, which raises the price, which might deter people from using oil and maybe influence them to go towards batteries or solar or wind or some other form of energy generation or something else to put in their vehicle.
Let me ask you this. Is the sage-grouse a pawn or a tool, basically, by folks who want to end extractive resources?
Well, I think it is. But the environmentalists, and I'm not against environmentalists, because of what they've done, like in L.A. But they're using this climate change as a tool along with the sage-grouse. That's what they're saying. If we put the sage-grouse on the endangered species list, you just shut down the West. Is essentially what you're going to do. And I wanted to know if there was any bearing for that.
Okay. Well, thanks for your call.
That's all I wanted to know.
I have a comment from Katie on Facebook, and I think this is a callback to right before the top of the hour. We were talking about present-day signs of pollution and the issue of climate change. And she says, it sounds like you are conflating pollution abatement with climate change. Countries will look for their economic self-interests first, and economic maturation to first-world status through technological innovation and free market principles would do far more to ease pollution than massive government regulation and things like global carbon credits that only enrich and transfer wealth from the citizens to their governments.
Well, I think the issue of the economy is important here too, and I think that's what you're getting at. And I think that there are lots of room for increases in jobs in the area of energy. If we look at non-renewable sources of energy and some of the jobs that are going to be created as a result of that, I think we're a very creative and industrious society, and that we're resilient. So if some jobs disappear, other jobs will then appear. I remember when computers first came online, people said, well, the computers are going to take over all the jobs. There won't be any employment any longer. But in fact, we need lots of software people. We need people that are creating new advanced versions of computers. So I think the same thing's going to happen in terms of technology and renewable energy.
Computers didn't take over our jobs. They just made wages stop rising and automated everything. I guess my question to you, though, going back to the computer example, when we talk about computers and the use of them by businesses, there was no government influence saying, go get a computer and start using it. You know, there was no big international talks on why we all need to use computers. People just started using them because they were technologically efficient and they helped people make more money and do their jobs better, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to a lot of these environmental technologies, it seems like governments have been throwing money at this issue for a long time. I mean, just look at wind credits in the United States, plus 20 years. For example, we've been subsidizing this industry, and a lot of people feel we're throwing good money after bad on this.
Solar energy is the same way.
When we should be waiting for better technologies that arise naturally.
Well, and there also are, of course, huge subsidies to the fossil fuel industry as well. So, yeah, I mean, government support, government incentives, policies, like I said before, the free rider issue, so you want to make sure that everybody's involved. There is a need for that kind of thing, as well as a need for grassroots initiatives. So I think you have to have both.
Okay. Sorry, you need to have both what?
Both. You have to have policy, you have to have incentives, you have to have good collaboration at international levels, so that one country's not doing everything and another country says, I'm not going to do anything because the other country isn't doing anything. That's the situation we had between the United States and China for a while. I remember President Bush said, we can't do anything here in the United States because China's not doing anything. And I think he was on the right track in the sense that we need China to be part of this whole process. Now China's made and they've made an agreement with us in the United States that they are going to go to renewables. They're going to have 20% of all their energy by renewables in the next couple of decades. So,
do you trust China?
They've
been so good when it comes to hacking and foreign affairs and their currency and everything else. I'm wondering how they'll do on climate.
Well, yeah, that's a good question, John, because
it's affecting their own people.
Partly, but the other thing is, if we look at China in terms of its international agreements, we see a very high compliance rate. China has been a good citizen in terms of
like the South China Sea and.
Well, there's no international agreement there. But if you look, for example, at the issue of ozone and the cooperation in the ozone layer, that's something that China has been very, very compliant with. So I think China really wants to be a good player internationally these days.
Okay, let's get back to the phones. Tyler, you're on Talkback with Dr. Koehn. Go ahead.
I'm confused. This is the same China that we're talking that's building a new coal power plant every 5 days, right? Same China?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's not. It's not all one-sided, is it? There are things going in one direction that I looked at from the local level, and then there's some things going on at the national level in China that move in the other direction. You're right about that.
Mike, I've got a couple questions. First of all, when was the last ice age?
What was the last what?
Ice age.
Ice age. I'm sorry.
You tell me.
I don't know. I think it's like 80,000 years ago or something like that.
Well, it depends on what you qualify an ice age.
It was a mini ice age, I think, back in the early 1800s, and just the eastern part of the country. So, I don't.
The big one that covered most of the continental United States with glacier.
I don't know.
Ice Age 5 just came out on video, released like 6 months ago.
What was the population of the world back then?
Okay, I've got it right here. The last glacial period, popularly known as the Ice Age, was most recently approximately 110,000 to 12,000 years ago.
Okay. How many cars were driving around back then?
0.
Why are the environmentalists trying to reduce CO2? Are they trying to kill all the trees or what? I mean, I thought these guys liked trees.
So I think what Tyler's getting at here, Professor Koehn, is this idea, and it's not one that that Tyler has.
Carbon dioxide is bad.
Well, no, that warming periods are a good sign for humanity, that U.S., or not just U.S., but humanity in general prospers during warmer periods. And there have been times in the past where there were grapes in England and the Greenland was actually green. And people look back on these historic periods and say, hey, this is when humanity was blossoming. What's your comment on that?
Thanks, Tyler.
Yeah, well, this is a bit out of my area because I'm not a scientist, but I do think that there's considerable evidence that what's going to happen is we're going to have a sea level rise, which is not going to be good for humanity if you live in a coastal city. One of the problems is oceans have been a repository for a lot of carbon, and they're not. They may be saturated at this point in time. We're looking at business as usual. We're looking at an increase in the total temperature on the globe of about 3.6 degrees centigrade by the year 2100. So these are all extremes that we're talking about, and I'm not sure the extremes are what we want.
We have a Facebook comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, this one's from Gloria. She says, what role does nature and natural events play in your analysis? Most of us are conscientious and are good stewards and believe that the world has and is constantly changing. Dare we say that God is in charge of the universe?
Well, I think nature definitely is an important factor, and to some extent nature has been protecting us in terms of the impact of global greenhouse gases. I think the oceans are a good example of that. But we have to remember that nature is really precious and fragile. And so we have to be good stewards of our nature as well. And I think that's another reason why we have to take seriously the issues that are in front of us.
Okay, let's get Alan on the line. Alan, you're on with Dr. Koehn. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm flabbergasted. I don't know where to start. I guess I'll start by giving a little of my background.
Okay.
I'm a retired meteorologist, 20 years Air Force meteorologist, another 13 with the federal government. I have a bachelor's degree in physics. I have a bachelor's degree in meteorology, and I have a master's degree in meteorology. And I have followed this issue that is now called climate change since it began back in the 60s and 70s. In the 70s, it was, we're going to go into the next ice age. Then it didn't get cold, so they said it's going to be global warming. Well, it didn't warm, so they changed it to climate change. Now, let me start with a very simple fact. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. The Supreme Court can claim carbon dioxide is a pollutant, but carbon dioxide is basically the essence of life. Without carbon dioxide on this planet, there would be no life, no trees, nothing. Now, the levels of carbon dioxide currently are approximately 400 parts per million. That is up from about 1930 at 250 parts. But historically, that is extremely low. At the present time, these trees, these plants that we all worship and love are experiencing carbon dioxide starvation. They need about 1,500 parts per million to grow in a healthy manner. There's been times on this planet when the carbon dioxide has been as high as 5,000 parts per million, and the climate didn't have a catastrophe.
Hey, Alan, real quick, just on the science. How do we know that? How do we know the parts per million that were in the past?
Because they have taken the ice core samples from Vostok in the Antarctic and have been able to determine that from reading the ice core samples.
Because we've got bubbles in the ice
Yes.
that we can read? Okay.
Yes. And in fact, right now, planet Earth is in what's called an interglacial period. Period between ice ages, or the warm period. The carbon dioxide and the temperature traces that they have taken from Vostok show the current interglacial period, the one we're currently in, is cooler than most and perhaps the coolest interglacial period the Earth has ever experienced. Now, this is work based by Richard Lindzen, Dr. Richard Lindzen of MIT. Now, a man by the name of Niels Bohr published a paper in 1913. Bohr was an atomic physicist, one of the first. His paper was titled On the Constitution of Atoms and Molecules. In that paper, Niels Bohr showed that gas molecules that absorb wavelength-specific infrared or radiation the molecule is not heated, but it just changes the energy state of the molecule. So the whole theory of greenhouse gas heating the atmosphere has basically been disproven. The only evidence, scientific evidence, that is being used is not scientific evidence at all, but it's predictions from computer models.
Okay, now, Alan, forgive me. Do you have a question for Dr. Koehn?
Yeah. Okay, a question.
Okay. All right.
When in the history of planet Earth has the climate not changed?
Alan, I was listening to everything you had to say, and I'm not in a position to argue with you because this is not my area of expertise. And I guess my answer to your question is probably never. I think the climate always changes, and I think there's microclimates, as I mentioned earlier. But what I do know is that I think the figure is 87% of all scientists.
No, sir, I'm sorry. That is a bogus figure. If you go to an institution called Oregon Institute of Medicine Science, you'll find that there is a petition there. There's over 40,000 scientists that have signed that petition, claiming that they can find no human print on climate.
Real quick, he didn't get to finish what the 87% is. We realize that you happen to know what that claim was. What was the claim originally?
87% of scientists say that climate change is real, and it's caused in part by human activity.
I'm sorry, sir, but we do not do climate or do science by consensus. If we had done climate by consensus back in Galileo's day, that's how it was done, and he was put in jail.
Well, I think that this is exactly why this talk show is so important, because you have a chance to express your opinion, and we respect that.
I wanted to talk, by the way, he is not a climate scientist. Dr. Peter Koehn is a specialist in international relations and in the way that treaties are made and the way that governments interact with each other, and happens to be a specialist on the issue of climate when it comes to these countries dealing with each other.
Okay.
But not necessarily on the science behind it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that it seems to me has been a political disadvantage for those that would like to see governments work together to decrease climate change has been the fear-mongering over climate change in the past. If you go back to the early 90s or even the early 2000s, or the early 2000s, and listen to some of the claims that were made about what the world would be like now because of climate change, there's some really silly stuff out there. And it's been going on for 20 years or more, where people have made these outrageous claims about how horrible the world's going and how we're going to have all these drastic, crazy hurricanes next year and all these predictions that don't end up being true. And so I guess I would like to hear from you. I mean, how do you suss out...
It's like the boy who cried wolf.
How do you suss out the real problems from the wolf, the crying wolf in the story?
Well, I think you made some good points, John, and I think that we have to be very careful about the science that we do, and we have to consider all different kinds of opinions. I think we have to be sure that we read widely, that we don't just take a few narrow opinions and go with them. But what I fall back on, both as a political scientist but also as a father, is I fall back on something that's called the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle basically says that if we are faced with some kind of really critical and potentially irreversible problems and challenges, then we should take some corrective action, even if the science is not conclusive, even if there's not enough evidence to be sure that something's going to happen. And, I think that's important because I want to be sure that my kids have a safe and a healthy future. And so in this particular case, I think if the evidence leans in that direction, I would act on the precautionary principle. But I agree with you that we don't want these outrageous claims because that kind of discredits the whole thing.
Okay, let's get Emmett on the line. Emmett, you're on with Dr. Koehn. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for taking my call. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And Alan's call really was fantastic. I couldn't have said it better, and he took a lot of the calls, including his, took away a lot of my thunder. My only thing, of course, I've heard that, however, the ice caps on Mars are melting, and there's no man-made global warming or whatever over there. But I've also heard that, from radio shows and such, that according to models, there's more ice on the ice caps here on planet Earth. The ice caps, like in
the ice caps in the Antarctic are, at last report, were growing.
Exactly. So, exactly, and if you remember the winter of 1987, that was relatively mild. Then 1988-89, it was below freezing. This fall seems to be relatively mild. My point is that yes, the Earth is always in a state of flux. We're never just either warming up too warm or too cold, so that's another thing. But I think this whole climate change thing, as far as the business, the economic, I'm glad you pointed out that he is not a climate scientist, is used to control people's behavior, what we eat, how much we drive, and I think that's very concerned for us liberty-minded people in America. So could you let him answer that?
Just so you know, I wasn't pointing that out as an accusation. I just wanted to let everybody know that that's his specialty.
Yes. So as using climate change as a stick to beat people into doing things.
Yeah, I can't see any evidence of that. I think in this country, people are still given lots of opportunity to choose what they want to do, and I think they do. I mean, we've just raised the speed limit here in Montana to 80 miles per hour in a number of places.
But at least it's not reasonable and prudent.
So
I remember those days.
Yes, that's right. I do remember those days.
I had a question for you, too. It seems to me when it comes to the political issue, right, you have only so much political currency between countries, only so much leverage that each country has over the other's will. And, with the recent attacks in Paris, the climate summit being held in Paris, I have no doubt that one of the big agenda issues while these talks are going on is going to be the issue of terrorism in Syria. Whatever they might be there to meet about.
And what did Bernie Sanders say?
Well, he said that climate change was going to lead to more terrorism, right? So, at least at the Saturday debates. So I guess my question for you is, do you think that political events besides the environment, for example, terrorism, for example, migrant crises, are going to make it harder for countries to want to spend their political currency on climate?
That's a really good question, John. I think that it's hard to say. I can't predict at that level, but I think there's reason to think that might happen. I think that climate change, because it's something that we're looking at trends here, and this has something to do with Emmett's question, I think that what we really have to look at is not any one particular year, but we have to look at trends. And since climate change is the real catastrophic dimensions of it are down the road, that can always get pushed back. And so when something like terrorism is really on the hot item on the agenda, I think it very well could have an impact on what's discussed in Paris. In terms of other things, maybe overtaking it.
The tyranny of the urgent, right?
Yeah, good point.
So let's get back to the phones. People have been waiting very patiently. Harlan, you're up first. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Dr. Kearns. Hopefully this will be a pure geopolitical question for you and not about the science.
Okay.
Some of the big talk is, China has finally come to the table and they're willing to talk about pollution, coming back on pollution, so we stand a chance. But you read further into their letters and it says, we'll agree to anything so long as it's non-intrusive, non-punitive, and respecting national sovereignty. Do you really think they can be trusted to meet any cutbacks, or is this the sort of proverbial "the check is in the mail, trust us"?
Well, I think that.
Thanks, Harlan.
I think the meeting in Cancun a couple of years ago, there was an agreement that China reluctantly went along with on investigating and verifying things that are decisions and that are being made in country. So I think they're committed to that. I think that there are some problems within China, and the people in China are also some people there are working to try to get better monitoring. They now have alerts, pollution alerts that are more reliable. The U.S. Embassy started that. And then they found that the Chinese government found that so many people were plugging into the U.S. Embassy's call on that they decided to do a more accurate job of reporting themselves. So I think there's some things happening in that area.
I think that we have a recipe here. If you want to have a successful climate talk, hold it in the Caribbean, where everyone's hot as heck.
Right, just before a hurricane. Let's get Michael on the line. Michael, you're on with Dr. Kearn. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Dr. Crew and John and Peter. How are you guys?
Doing good, Michael. How are you, sir?
What's up?
Good. Oh, there was a great article in the Missoula about a week ago in the opinion portion of the paper on weather manipulation and how Americans are ignoring the manipulation of weather called geoengineering. I don't know if you had a chance to read that article or not. It was about a half-page article, and it was really good on... I do believe in man-made global climate change due to weather manipulation called geoengineering. And all you got to do is look up. I've been doing this for 11 years. I am a sane person. I believe I have a good head on my shoulder. I know for a fact from my own eyes that I see just about every other day that there is global weather manipulation.
All right. Thanks for your call, Michael.
Thanks for the call. So what do you think, Doctor?
Well, I'm not I'm not familiar with that particular article or with your observations, or I haven't had the same observations.
Well, you've heard about cloud seeding, right?
Yeah,
where we
cloud
try to
seeding.
make rain fall, and other countries are obviously at least countries have experimented with changing climate themselves, right?
Well, I think that geoengineering is being tossed around as a solution to global warming, too, in the sense that we can do some really massive things in the atmosphere to try to reflect the rays of the sun to keep things cooler and things like that. I think this is all speculative and
isn't that playing a pretty dangerous game of messing with Mother Nature?
I think it's potentially very dangerous. I agree with you, Peter.
All right, let's get back to the phones. Sue, you're on with Dr. Kearn. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Sue.
I've known Peter a long time through our kids have gone to school together. But I am wondering, totally off the subject of what you're talking about, but with the recent budget cuts going on, I heard last night that the political science department is going to take a hit, and since my son is majoring in political science, he's kind of wondering what's going to happen, and I'm wondering if you could answer any question there.
Okay, thanks, Sue.
Okay, well, I figured that this question, something about the cuts might come up today. So, but yeah, let me talk a little bit about the political science department. I think that, first of all, I'd like to say we have a great group of colleagues. They're terrific teachers. They're very committed. They're very well informed. They're dedicated to their job. And we also have great students, and so I don't think I've had your son yet in class, but I hope I do at some point in time. And I don't think anything's going to change in terms of the students who are enrolled right now in our department. It may be that we'll have to make some adjustments down the road in terms of who teaches what. We may be short some faculty, which is a shame because we've been a department that has really been the cash cow in many respects for the university over time. And these kinds of trends in enrollment have a way of going back and forth. And our department in particular, we have rises and dips. So I think that we'll weather this storm. I think we'll come out fine in the end. And basically what we need more students right now. So tell your son to tell his friends to major in political science.
Now, I will say this, at the press conference after his speech, Dr. Engstrom was asked about what about the students who are in these programs. And his first response was, we are going to do everything to make sure that the people that are in those programs will have a path to graduation and that will not be interrupted. So, yeah.
We're not going to cut the political science department or any of the degrees that are offered in the political science department. It's just going to probably mean more work for us.
Now, before the show, you were telling me this isn't your first go-around with cuts at the University of Montana, right?
Yeah, there was a time, and I was trying to remember, John, when that was. I think it was in the late 1970s when we had what we called the rift, and a number of faculty who were not tenured were given what we call pink slips. That worked out very negatively.
How so?
Well, they were mostly our young faculty. We lost a whole generation. These people had a pink slips that thought that they were going to lose their job because they were given some time before they to go and look for another job. And most of them did. They found another job at other universities. Then they found out that they could bring those people back, that they didn't really have much of a shortfall as they thought. Wow. It was too late. They were already gone.
Wow.
And we lost a whole generation. I lost a really good colleague in my department, for example. And that actually was, I think, a lesson that we should remember, that you set a downward spiral into effect if you do this kind of thing.
To the phones, because we're running out of time. We have 6 minutes. So, Dave, you're on with Dr. Koehn. Go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate the chance. I used to be a forester. I'm retired now. And one of the comments the doctor made for global warming and proof is the intensity of forest fires. And after this little statement, I used to work here in Montana, but I ended up in Northern California. And down there, they used to log on 2 national forests 600 million board feet per year. And with all the changes and stuff, they're down to about 2% of that, 2 to 4%. Well, these national forests each grew, according to the forest plan, over 1 billion board feet a year. So do you feel that increased growth could be one of the reasons why we have such extreme fire behavior now, not just, quote, global warming?
Okay, thanks for your call. So what do you think?
Well, I wish I had my friends in the forestry department here to answer that question for you. I really, if I were to say something, I might say the wrong thing. I just don't have any expertise in this area at all. It's a good question, though, Dave. I appreciate it.
See, this caution is what makes him a political science professor and not a politician.
No, I don't think it's just caution. I think you have to be really careful to say what you know, but not to say what you don't know.
And that's what makes you a political science professor and not a politician.
That's right.
My point.
So you don't suffer too much from the foot and mouth disease.
I mean, who would talk about what they don't know about, like how the pyramids are for grain storage?
Yeah,
for
well, everybody knows that. All right, Marilyn is on Talkback. Hi, Marilyn.
Hello, good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Alan for calling in with his scientific viewpoint. And thank goodness, there's some people still out there that can critical think and haven't been brainwashed. And I, for one, am more concerned about, maybe this is more in Stilo's realm, I'm more concerned about communism, socialism, fascism, authoritarians, totalitarian, the whole control the people thing. And isn't that a more dire need of the people? I constantly see them using this to bring us more into compliance, more control, more expensive utilities on our part. So, okay, the question is, don't you think communism, socialism, and all those other isms are worse than
climate change? Okay.
Right.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the call, Marilyn. Okay, go ahead. What do you think, Doctor?
Well, I think those are, it's an issue. It's an important issue. We have to talk about what kind of political regimes we'd like in this world. I think we have a limited ability to dictate those to other places. And I think we do a good job here in this country of trying to make sure that we have the kind of political system that we're happy with, even if that political system tends to be stalemated at times. So there's some positives, certainly a lot of positives about the kind of system we have, and then some questionable issues that we need to work on ourselves.
Okay, let's get Roy on the line. Roy, you're on with Dr. Koehn. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, Dr. Koehn and
Hi,
Peter,
Roy.
John.
What's up?
Hope you're having a nice day.
Real quickly, we have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I am, this so-called crisis in climate change has been going on for years. And I have a tendency to have the same opinion as Al does, that the climate's been changing for years and years, and there's no real solid evidence that it's mainly man-caused. What I'm concerned about is how does the professor feel about the carbon tax or carbon credits that these governments or our government would like to impose upon businesses and people to so-called change the climate?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to have him answer that because we're running out of time. Thank you. So, Doctor, what do you think about carbon credits?
Good. I appreciate the carbon tax question, and I think that I am for a carbon tax. I think it's a simple and quick and easy way to have people see the consequences of the use of fossil fuels. What I'm also for is a rebate of the carbon tax in terms of the money that is raised through the tax being given back to people so that they have more, so there's more employment, so they have more income, and they can spend it on other things besides fossil fuels.
How do you measure and enforce?
How do you measure?
How do you measure when people are using more carbon than they're so allotted?
No, that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about the tax, not the carbon credits.
Well, sure, but to tax them appropriately, you have to have a measurement to see how much they get taxed, right?
No, it's you just simply raise, for example, the tax on gasoline. When you go and fill up your vehicle, you'll pay more.
So it'd be a sales tax on gasoline?
Yes, that's that kind of a tax, right.
Okay.
Okay. Now we're less than a minute left. So if you want to get folks to get in touch with you at the Political Science Department, or perhaps support you in the cuts that are going on, if they want to express their support, how can they get in touch with you and your department?
Well, my phone number is 243-5294.
All right. Dr. Koehn, you've been a delight. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.